Coming up on Arirang News, South Korean President Moon Jae-in calls for all parties to make the most out of dialogue with North Korea. All sides need to avoid provocative actions to build peace and prosperity. The South Korean Trade Ministry proposes a national strategy to guide the local parts and materials industry through the changes to come in the global market. It aims in part to reduce Korea's reliance on imports from other countries. And Trade Minister Sung Yun-mo announces a new committee that'll work across the government to boost Korea's competitiveness in parts and materials and to help companies deal with Japan's restrictions on trade. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning into our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in has called on relevant parties to make the most out of North Korea's dialogue with South Korea and the U.S., which is resumed and is making progress. He said this is an opportunity that might never come again, and actions that undermine it should be avoided. Here's the president today in a weekly meeting with his top aides.
깨지기 쉬운 유리그릇을 다루듯 조심스럽게 한 걸음씩 나아가는 신중함이 필요합니다. 서로 상대방의 입장을 헤아리고 역지사지하는 지혜와 진정성을 가져야 할 것입니다. 대화에 도움이 되는 일은 더해가고 방해가 되는 일은 줄여가는 상호 간의 노력까지 함께 해야 대화의 성공을 거둘 수 있을 것입니다.
President Moon also reiterated the message in his National Liberation Day speech last week that establishing a peace economy with North Korea is the main challenge and opportunity for South Korea. He says it's necessary to make both countries peaceful and strong. It's now less than 100 days until the city of Busan hosts a special group summit with Southeast Asian countries. The members of ASEAN and South Korea will be looking to expand trade, and there's a chance that North Korea's Kim Jong-un might be invited. Our Blue House correspondent Shin Se-min reports.
The 100-day countdown is on for the special summit with ASEAN member nations. The Korea Association of Southeast Asian Nations Special Summit is set for 2 days from November 25th, and the inaugural Korea-Mekong Summit taking place a day later on November 27th. The summit, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the establishment of official dialogue between South Korea and ASEAN, will be the third of its kind to be held in South Korea after the first in 2009 and second in 2014. President Moon Jae-in has placed great attention on advancing relations with ASEAN as a way of expanding South Korea's diplomacy, which has long been primarily focused on the four major powers, the U.S., China, Russia, and Japan. Topping the agenda, establishing a joint will to pursue the free trade order against the backdrop of growing trade tensions, including the intensifying clash between Seoul and Tokyo.
South Korea and ASEAN nations will seek ways to expand trade, strengthen free trade order, and to explore ways for shared prosperity through mutual cooperation, especially at a time of heightened trade tensions between major economies.
The meeting will also focus on expanding cooperation with ASEAN nations in regards to the Korean peace process, as well as its support for the so-called peace economy, a term coined by the Moon administration to signify that peace can be promoted through inter-Korean economic projects. And South Korea's presidential office has suggested North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un might be invited to Busan for the ASEAN meeting as a special guest if talks with the U.S. get back on track after a prolonged lull on diplomacy. As for South Korea's top office sending that highly anticipated invitation north of the border to attend a special summit with ASEAN, the presidential office said that all depends on the nuclear negotiations and the progress made between Pyongyang and Washington. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
The U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, will be in Seoul on Tuesday, the day South Korea-U.S. joint military exercises wrap up. The U.S. State Department says Biegun will meet his South Korean and Japanese counterparts during trips to both countries to further strengthen coordination on North Korea's complete denuclearization. The North leader has told President Trump in a letter that they would like to resume negotiations as soon as the joint drills are over. Biegun is in Tokyo today and tomorrow, and in Seoul from tomorrow to Thursday. Other officials from South Korea and the U.S. are meeting in Seoul on Tuesday as well for talks on sharing the cost of American troops stationed on the peninsula. According to a diplomatic source, the South Korean Foreign Ministry's delegate, Chang Won-sam, will meet his American counterpart, Timothy Betts. They were the chief negotiators in the previous talks on the 10th Special Measures Agreement, a defense cost-sharing deal signed in March for keeping the roughly 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in the South. That deal was good only for this year, so talks will start soon on the next deal. North Korea and China over the weekend reaffirmed what they called their traditional friendship. Officials from their militaries met in Beijing. Lee Seung-jae reports.
On Saturday, Kim Soo-gil, the director of General Political Bureau of the Korean People's Army, held talks in Beijing with Zhang Yuxia, the chairman of China's Central Military Commission. According to China's state-run Xinhua news agency, the meeting highlighted the traditional friendship between North Korea and China. It said China is willing to work with the North to strengthen communication and promote cooperation and mutual support so as to contribute to the consolidation and development of bilateral relations and regional peace and stability. In response, North Korea's state-run Korean Central News Agency reported that Kim Soo-gil said Pyongyang is also ready to strengthen friendly exchanges between the two armed forces in various fields and mutual learning, and promote the relations between the two countries and the two armed forces to a higher level. The high-level talks came after Kim Soo-gil also held talks with Miao Hua, the director of the Political Affairs Department of China's Central Military Commission. Experts say China may be why the North has been strongly responding to the scaled-down joint military exercises between Seoul and Washington.
I want to say carefully that North Korea has called for an end to the South Korea-U.S. combined military exercise as a result of coordination with China.
Other experts say the aggressive response to the drills could negatively affect future nuclear negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington. The two sides have yet to hold the working-level talks their leaders promised when they met at the DMZ in June. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Some analysts think North Korea might be almost ready to deploy the new weapons it's been testing the past several weeks. Joint military drills by South Korea and the U.S. will be ending tomorrow, so another question is whether that means the North will stop its tests. Oh Jang-hee has more.
North Korea seems set to deploy new types of short-range projectiles after a series of tests over the past few weeks. On Saturday, the state-run Korean Central News Agency reported that the regime tested a new weapon the previous day, and Kim Jong-un personally oversaw the launch. The report didn't provide any details about the weapon itself, but revealed 6 photos of it, which showed the same new weapon the regime tested the week prior. The weapon is assessed by military experts as North Korea's version of ATACMS, a surface-to-surface tactical missile system developed by the U.S. It carries several hundred rounds of submunitions, which can level an area as large as 3 to 4 soccer fields. The North's test fire of the new weapon comes in addition to its test of a new guided multiple rocket launcher and a new short-range ballistic missile that resembles Russia's Iskander and has a pull-up maneuver. Pyongyang claims that all the tests were successful, which points to the possibility that deployment of the weapons could be drawing near. North Korea has stressed its recent missile tests are an eye-for-an-eye move against the South Korea-U.S. joint military exercises. Over the weekend, it once again emphasized it needs to deploy some, quote, powerful physical means to counter potential threats. But as the Seoul-Washington Combined Command Post training wraps up on Tuesday, eyes fall on whether the North will stop missile testing as well. South Korea's intelligence authorities say the North is carrying out back-to-back test firings at this time because it won't be able to once working-level denuclearization talks with the U.S. get underway when the drills are over. Oh Jang-hee, Arirang News.
South Korea has urged Japan to give a clear and detailed plan of how it'll clean up the radioactive water from Fukushima. Seoul's foreign ministry summoned Japan's economic minister at the Japanese embassy in Seoul on Monday to relay the government's concerns. It urged Japan to respond to a report by Greenpeace Korea saying that Japan has decided to discharge more than 1 billion liters of the wastewater into the Pacific Ocean, which would cause serious damage to the whole ocean and neighboring countries. Seoul offered to work with Tokyo to find a solution so that the surrounding ecosystem is not harmed. The economic minister reportedly explained the Japanese government's stance and said he will relay Seoul's concerns to Tokyo. Artists and activists are calling for Japan's biggest international art festival to bring back a statue symbolizing the women and girls sexually enslaved by Japan during wartime. And a petition by them to that effect has gotten nearly 30,000 signatures in 3 weeks. The artists who made the petition were due to hold a press conference today at the local government office near the arts festival in Aichi Prefecture. They'll be urging the organizers of the Aichi Triennale to put the so-called Comfort Women statue back on display. It had been on display for the festival's first 3 days, but was taken down because of alleged terror threats and a Japanese government order to remove it. An event was held in Mexico City on Saturday to mark the 100th anniversary of Korea's provisional government, founded in exile, and of the March 1st movement for independence. 7,000 people gathered at the Plaza de la República for a concert called Symphony for Peace, which included a joint performance of the Korean folk song Arirang by Korean and Mexican artists. The event was organized by Korea's Cultural Heritage Administration and the Mexican government. 100 years ago, Koreans went as far as Mexico to fight for their country's liberation from Japan. This was the first time that Arirang has been performed on such a large scale in collaboration with a foreign government. Another pro-democracy march took place in Hong Kong on Sunday for the 11th week over a now suspended extradition bill. But unlike the previous demonstration, Sunday's gathering was peaceful. Kim Da-mi has the details.
Braving torrential downpours, hundreds of thousands of people returned to the streets of Hong Kong, this time at Victoria Park. The park was the starting point of the huge peaceful marches in June. As protesters planned, the march remained peaceful throughout the day for the first time in 4 weeks. There was no use of tear gas by the police, and people freely marched through the city with their umbrellas, including through the Causeway Bay and Wan Chai areas. The police did approve the Sunday rally, but still didn't allow a march through the central district, fearing possible clashes like before. But protesters marched anyway. According to the organizers, around 1.7 million people participated in the demonstrations, but police tallied the number far lower at 128,000 people. The protest began back in June over a controversial but now scrapped extradition law. But demonstrations now focus on 5 demands based on greater democratic freedoms, including the formal withdrawal of an extradition bill and an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality.
The campaign has the support, but the government doesn't. So we urge that Carrie Lam must listen to people's voices and implement the 5 demands, and also ask the police to revisit, to reconsider their strategies against protesters.
Fortunately, China's military, which was seen conducting exercises near Hong Kong, did not intervene in Sunday's protest. But concerns remain that the Chinese government may use military from the mainland to crack down on the protesters. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
South Korea's trade ministry has come up with a strategy for industry and trade to guide the country through the changes to come in the global value chain over the next 1 or 2 decades. Hong Yu reports.
South Korea's trade ministry has proposed a national strategy project to increase the country's advanced material and equipment production capability within the global value chain. South Korea's exports rely heavily on the global value chain, or GVC, where products manufactured involve specialized activities in several countries. Only 3 countries are more reliant on the global value chain, but the GVC has been changing with the 4th Industrial Revolution and the changing global trade environment. The Trade Ministry says that global value chains are becoming regionalized, with U.S. President Donald Trump trying to keep the GVC of U.S. products within North America. China is keeping its GVC within China, Japan within ASEAN, and Germany within the EU. China's increasing self-sufficiency of components amid the trade dispute with the U.S. has become a crisis and also an opportunity for South Korea. The ministry's proposal focuses on forming a new GVC that can increase the exports of materials and equipment to China, as they will continue to import such items from abroad. It also said the government should promote M&As and innovation to adapt to the changing global value chain. This proposal was taken into account when the government announced measures to eliminate the country's external dependent industrial structure as part of its efforts to cope with Japan's recently imposed export curbs. Meanwhile, a support team created by the government has started helping businesses that are affected by Japan's export curbs. This team will focus on using extra funding, tax relief, and deregulation to ease the burden on South Korean firms. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the government is pushing to create an inter-ministry committee to oversee measures aimed at boosting the competitiveness of South Korea's parts, materials, and equipment industries. Trade Minister Sung Yun-mo made the remarks on Monday in a meeting with ruling party lawmakers while explaining plans to help those industries deal with Japan's trade curbs. Here he is this morning.
For the effective and continuous implementation of policies, we are seeking to establish a government-wide committee. We are also pushing to revise special acts for the parts, materials, and equipment industries. The government is working with related ministries so there are no supply problems. We think this is an opportunity to fundamentally boost our competitiveness.
He added that the government is almost done getting ready to waive the preliminary feasibility studies required for big-budget projects in those industries. It's hoped that'll speed up improvements to their competitiveness because until now, projects getting more than $24 million from the government had to carry out those tests to prevent waste. Ruling party lawmakers said they'll visit more small and big companies to hear what they make of the government's plans and to take their demands into consideration when deciding on future support. It's time now for an in-depth look at the global markets this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Hwang Se-eun, Research Fellow at the Korea Capital Market Institute. Dr. Hwang, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for inviting me today.
Well, last Friday, Wall Street ended sharply higher as concerns over interest rates seemed to ease. Here in Korea, stocks were up on this Monday. What's the story today?
In Wall Street, the stocks ended higher Friday as a rebound in bond yields eased fears of recession that sent stocks tumbling earlier in the week. Major stock averages are set to post their third straight weekly losses, with the S&P 500 down about 1% so far. August has been a volatile and brutal month for the stock market as the Dow has lost nearly 4%. The yield curve inversions, along with U.S.-China trade war, are big drivers of market movements. However, stocks in the U.S. gained as Treasury yields continued to recover from multi-year lows reached last week. Stocks in Asia gained as traders kicked off a busy week for economic data and awaited commentary from the Federal Reserve chief. Shares in Hong Kong and China led gains, helped in part by Beijing's plan to reform its interest rate system and lower borrowing costs. Equities were also higher in Tokyo and Seoul. South Korea's Kospi gained 0.66%, while Japan's Nikkei rose 0.71% today.
Yeah, now, as you referenced last week, we saw the rate on the U.S. 10-year Treasury fall below that of the 2-year, adding to fears of a global recession. Why did that happen, and what do you see happening on that front this week?
Bond yields climbed back from their historic lows last week. The U.S. 30-year Treasury yield dropped to a record low Thursday, while the yield on benchmark 10-year notes dipped to a 3-year low as investors sought out safe haven assets. The 10-year Treasury yields fell below the 2-year rate for the first time since 2007. Inversion didn't last, but the bond market is making its feelings about the outlook pretty clear. Normally, yield curves slope upward. So for the curve to invert implies that investors are forecasting that something unusual will happen, something that will push future interest rates down low enough to justify long-term yields being low despite the risks. A future recession can be a very good reason. Actually, if we look at the historical track record, every time the 2-year to 10-year inversion has happened, a recession has followed. While the empirical link between past inversion events and recessions is real, it is not quite clear how severe the recession would be. It is getting more obvious that the recession is coming. However, the timing and magnitude are still quite uncertain this time.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, now, this Friday, Fed Chair Jerome Powell will be giving a speech in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The IMF is sending evaluators to Korea this week as well. Tell us more about that and other events scheduled this week.
My news of the Fed's July meeting will provide details on the discussions leading to the first interest rate cut in a decade when they are released on Wednesday. In addition to this, Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank hosts its annual central banking symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, starting Thursday. Fed Chair Jerome Powell will give remarks on Friday. With market volatility soaring in August, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell's address at the Jackson Hole gathering on Friday will be key to gauging whether U.S. policymakers will add to July's rate cut. South Korean exports on Wednesday will offer an early read on the latest on global trade. The figures for August follow sharp year-on-year declines in both June and July. Global trade worries are also having an effect in Japan, where the yen's haven appeal is pushing the currency higher. The European Central Bank jumps into the spotlight on Thursday when the record of its last meeting is released. The gathering saw no policy change, but Mario Draghi said in train a countdown for September when a rate cut is expected. Quantitative easing is also on the table, though just as an option for now.
All right, Dr. Huang, thank you for coming on today as we start the week. That's where we'll have to leave it today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Now, the operating profits of South Korea's top 10 business groups more than halved in the first 6 months of this year due to weak semiconductor market and the U.S.-China trade tensions. Kim Yo-sun reports.
Major South Korean conglomerates suffered a major decline in their operating earnings in the first half of 2019. According to market researcher InfoBix, the combined operating profits of 90 listed companies affiliated with the nation's 10 largest business groups hovered around $17.5 billion in the first 6 months of the year. This is a staggering 53.5% decrease from a year earlier. The operating earnings for the second quarter in particular plunged a whopping 63% on year. The market researcher points to weak global demand for semiconductors and the prolonged trade war between the U.S. and China as the main reasons for the drop.
The conditions facing semiconductor industry would not be worse, but won't get better soon either. As the U.S.-China trade tensions escalate, conditions will not improve in the short term.
Hanwha Group had the biggest plunge in operating earnings, down 72.8%. Samsung Group and Hanjin Group's operating earnings dropped 65.9% and 63% respectively. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Hyundai Motor Group's operating profits jumped 38.6% thanks to strong demand for new models and the weak local currency. As the above figures do not reflect the uncertainties caused by Japan's trade curbs and the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, South Korean conglomerates are expected to face even more difficulties in the latter half of the year. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
The city of Seoul plans to add more parking spaces designated only for car sharing. The Seoul Metropolitan Government says every public parking lot with more than 10 spaces will have to set aside at least one spot for the use of the Seoul Nanum car service. The city aims to have 10,000 shared cars on the streets by 2022. Nanum Car currently has nearly 5,000 shared cars and plans to double its fleet and become a means of quasi-public transportation. Established in 2013, Nanum Car has been growing in popularity, recording more than 210,000 users last year. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.